Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to start tonight's program. I'm Bei Fong. I'm president of Radio Free Asia. We were created by Congress after the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, and our mission is to provide free press into countries in Asia that don't have it. So the idea is that we support the foreign policy mission of the U.S. by standing for freedom of the press, and I am also on the advisory board of the Micah Murray Mansfield Center. That was created to enhance mutual understanding between the U.S. and Asia and to foster ethical public policy and leadership. So we're very happy tonight to have with us Bonnie Glaser, a preeminent China scholar. She is director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the US. She was previously senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And for more than 3 decades, she's worked at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and US policy. So we're really excited tonight to be able to talk about what happened at the 20th Party Congress that just concluded last weekend, and what it means for the future of China, China-US relations, the future of the world. So Bonnie, thank you so much for being with us. So just to begin, as we all now know, Xi Jinping won an unprecedented third term at as the head of the party and the government during the just concluded 20th Party Congress. He's filled the Politburo Standing Committee with allies. We were just talking earlier about how it includes 3 of his former personal secretaries who obviously are loyal to him. So my first question is, having consolidated all of this power, what is his vision for the country? What's the place that he wants for China on the global stage?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Bei, and thanks to the Mansfield Center, of course, and to all of our viewers. It was such a busy week watching all of the elements of the Party Congress, which began with Xi Jinping's political report, where he summed up the achievements of the last 5 years, and then he talked about the agenda for the future. And then, of course, we saw the members of the Politburo Standing Committee come out on the stage and read the membership of the Politburo itself and the largest central committee. And then we got to see the new party constitution. And as you say, Bei, Xi Jinping really did run the table in all of what was achieved at the Party Congress. He is really an unprecedentedly strong leader in China, certainly much stronger than his prior 2 predecessors. And he does have a vision for the country. And part of that vision goes back to the very beginning, of course, of the establishment of the People's Republic. And that is the national rejuvenation of the country, restoring China to its rightful place in the world. That is not new. Xi Jinping at the last Party Congress actually attached a target date for achieving that particular goal. And that was a first. He said by 2049, the middle of the century, China should become a leading power, very strong, of course, in technology, but also have a first-class military, and to have achieved the main goals of national rejuvenation. So that his vision is first and foremost for restoring China to greatness. And then I think, of course, external to China, he has ambitions as well. Xi Jinping, when he was first elected the Secretary General of the party, he talked about how China should participate in global governance reform. And then a few years later, he talked about how China should guide the reform of global governance. And then in 2018, he actually said China should lead global governance reform. And so increasingly, we see that Xi Jinping has ambitions for reshaping the international community and the system itself, making it more favorable to Chinese interests. And of course, the international order that's in place was really established by the United States and its allies after World War II. It's very much founded on the liberal norms of Western countries. US alliances are a core part of the network that underpins the international order. And I think these are two things that Xi Jinping is not comfortable with. He would like to see alliances done away with. And he has introduced core socialist norms, socialist core values, if you will, within China. Then he wants to share that with the international community. So I believe that he does have ambitions to reshape the international orders, again, so it is more favorable to China, not necessarily to completely destroy it, as perhaps Vladimir Putin wants to do, because of course China has benefited from this post-World War II international order more than any country in the world. It has paved the way for China's economic development to become the powerhouse that it is today. But China's facing, obviously, some economic headwinds now. Its economy is slowing down, and I think that will be a challenge for Xi Jinping going forward. Is China's overall aggregate economy, for example, going to surpass that of the United States? Will China become number one? That seems to be very important to Xi Jinping. But that, and whether China overcomes the middle income trap, these are still question marks, I think.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with all of that. I was in China for U.S. News and World Report beginning in '98, and the first thing that I covered was then President Clinton's visit there and the granting of PNTR to China. And it was a pretty amazing moment because, that was when, I think Clinton made the now sort of infamous a speech about how, if China were to try to control the internet, it would be like nailing Jello to the wall. And of course, we've seen how successful they have been in controlling the internet to their own citizens. And I'm curious what you think. How successful has Xi Jinping been in the last a decade or so in creating this alternative to the Western international order? How many, sort of authoritarian countries, or how has he been able to, lead with his model of authoritarianism?
Well, I think that there has been some headway. Of course, this has only, I think, really in recent years become a priority agenda item for Xi Jinping. I don't think this was something he really started in his first term. But it has become more central to his agenda. We can look at the Human Rights Council in the UN as an example, where his grandiose concept of community of common destiny or shared future was essentially included in a resolution that was endorsed in a UN document. China has fairly successfully challenged the idea of universal human rights in the United Nations, which is unfortunate, but they have questioned whether there is a universal definition. And we recently saw that there was a vote in the UN Human Rights Council on whether the atrocities being committed in Xinjiang could even be debated by the UN Human Rights Council, and that failed. The vote came close. I think it was 2 votes shy of supporting a decision to have that debate. So it does show that there is growing concern, for example, about what is going on in Xinjiang. But this is just one example of how China has had some success in convincing countries that human rights is something that should focus on primarily economic concepts of people being brought out of poverty, having enough food to eat, rather than also including their freedoms, their right to speak out, have a free media, to publish their views, to voice dissent. But the Chinese believe that these kinds of freedoms should not be included in a definition of human rights, or at least it shouldn't be something that is universal. And countries should have the opportunity to choose their own definitions. And then we've seen in countries around the world, the Chinese have been more and more active in promoting the sale of surveillance systems, law enforcement training. The Chinese bring, particularly from countries in the global south, these delegations to parts of China where they then get trained on how to use the tools that China can provide to control dissent if they so choose, to also to control social media, and which of course China has learned how to do very effectively. And so these are practices that China is spreading around the world. I would not say that they have achieved an enormous amount of success in free democratic countries, but of course they have achieved, I think, some success in parts of the global south. And there are countries that want China's economic largesse, they want China's loans, and therefore they will tend to voice or mute their criticism of China in order to continue to get access to economic benefits from China. And that's harmful too.
Indeed, and we've actually found on the media side that they have actually made quite an inroad into even democratic countries, partly just from Xinhua, actually, the state-owned wire service, actually being able to seed its content into countries like Thailand, like Australia, Italy, so where they can just offer up their content for free, and a lot of purportedly open free media will accept it. So yeah, I completely agree with you. I'm interested in also what you mentioned about the economy, because one of the things that Xi reaffirmed, he basically reaffirmed all of his economic policies at the Party Congress, and one of them was like his zero COVID policy, which a lot of people see as sort of his Achilles heel, because it will be difficult in the future to stick to that and keep the economy going. It's obviously taken a huge hit in the last couple of years. So what do you see on that front? Do you think that that is something that could come back to haunt him?
Well, it's quite clear from the Party Congress political report, and not surprising, that Xi Jinping is not emphasizing economic growth. He is talking about common prosperity, which includes more equal distribution of the benefits of economic modernization and development, but not the economic growth of what we have seen in the past. And certainly the double-digit economic growth that China had for several decades was likely a permanent thing of the past. People are debating whether China is actually growing at the rate that they say they are. In the last quarter, the official statistic was 3.9%, and people I know say it was probably less than that. Some economists say that this year China will probably grow maybe between 1% and 2%. So China's economic growth is slowing down, and Xi Jinping is talking more about self-reliance, indigenous innovation. He is not talking about economic growth as a target of or a priority for his agenda. And COVID is part of this. It's not the the only reason why he is de-emphasizing economic growth. Absolutely, the pandemic has impacted China's economy in a very negative way. And if they were to move away from this zero COVID policy or dynamic zero COVID, probably economic growth would rebound to some extent, but I don't think that it would be that significant. But the problem here is that China still does not have a very effective vaccine for COVID. And it still has a very large percentage of its elderly population that has not been vaccinated. So they really need both an efficacious vaccine and maybe even mandatory vaccination for the elderly. There was recently a study that was done that looked at the number of COVID deaths in Hong Kong and then tried to estimate what the similar number of deaths would have been in mainland China if they had not imposed these lockdowns. And the statistic was something like 1.6 million deaths. And I think that that would be very difficult for the Chinese Communist Party to face and tolerate. It could really lead to questioning of the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to deliver good governance. And as I said, Xi Jinping is celebrated, right? Their model of governance, they're saying, is so good, it's ready to be exported abroad. So I don't think that at this moment that this is something that Xi Jinping is going to do. So I expect that this zero COVID policy will, and the lockdowns, all of it will be in place until China has a more effective COVID vaccine and is willing to at least find incentives, if not mandate that its elderly population get vaccinated.
So do you think, I mean, I think there was a lot of unhappiness, at least circulated on social media during especially the Shanghai lockdown. Do you think that there is any significant dissent that Xi Jinping should feel threatened by, either by the people or inside his own party?
Well, there is disgruntlement. There are complaints. People, in many cases, were angry. But we also should remember it's very difficult to put ourselves in the shoes of the Chinese people. And the Chinese government has told its people that COVID could kill them. And so they've been scared into believing that the government is protecting them. And in some cases they are, because as I said, they don't have a very effective vaccine. But of course, they did have the option of purchasing more effective vaccines from the West, and they chose not to do that. But they've really scared their people, who many of them believe that lockdowns are a better solution for them than death. But there's plenty of disgruntlement about the sudden lockdowns in particular. You know, all of a sudden you try to walk outside and you realize that your entire apartment complex has been fenced in and you can't go anywhere, and you can't go anywhere for several days, maybe even over a week. But I don't think that this disgruntlement is necessarily aimed at the highest level at Xi Jinping himself. I think there's a tradition in China blaming local leaders. So it may be that local leaders are blamed for the way that they have enforced this policy. There's certainly some people who blame the top leadership. And of course, Bay, about the incident just days before the party Congress, there was this huge banner in Haidian in Beijing on a bridge that basically said, no lockdowns, end these lockdowns, and give us more freedom. I forget the exact wording, but it's now been repeated. We've seen posters in universities around the United States that are repeating the words that were on this banner. So I've seen them on Twitter, and some people have sent me images, photos of these things that have been posted. These are likely posted by PRC citizens who are abroad in the United States and expressing their, as you use the word dissent. Certainly there are people who would like to see Xi Jinping out of power, but I don't think that that means that there is a potential for real challenges to Xi Jinping's rule. I think that's impossible. The development of the kind of surveillance equipment that they have, the way that they monitor, WeChat, Weibo, it is impossible to think that a person can get away with anonymously challenging the leadership. You will be caught. You will be imprisoned. There was a case several years ago, you probably remember, a woman who threw black ink on a poster with Xi Jinping's photo. And her father apparently recently died in prison, so tragically. Of course, we have no idea what happened to her.
Wow, yeah, indeed. That was a really remarkable, the guy who's now called Bridgeman, sort of in a throwback to Tank Man after Tiananmen Square. RFA was actually the first Mandarin media to confirm that story and to put it out, because it was being shut down as it was going on to Weibo and WeChat. And so we put it on Twitter and then circulated it. So yeah, indeed, I agree with all of that. I want to remind the audience, if you'd like, you can put questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We already have a few questions that were pre-submitted. Actually, there are a couple of questions about this. Do you have a theory about why Hu Jintao was escorted off the platform during the plenary session?
Oh, there are so many China watchers who are discussing that question. First, I have to say, we may never know. It is possible that people who have the ability to read lips, and of course Chinese, could look at this video and have a better knowledge about what the conversation was that was taking place, especially between Hu Jintao and Li Jianshu. And this is important because if you look at all the videos, you will see before Hu Jintao is escorted out, he has papers in front of him. And Li Jianshu, who is sitting next to him, is trying to take away these papers and prevent him from looking at the papers. And so one theory that makes sense to me is that Hu Jintao had in front of him the Central Committee list that he, and the Politburo list and the Standing Committee, and that he had not seen previously what the people, which people had been promoted to which parts of the system. Now, his protege, Hu Chunhua, was demoted from the Politburo to the Central Committee, and all of Hu Jintao's people from the China Youth League faction are all gone. So Wang Yang, being one example, could have remained on the Standing Committee, but did not. And so one theory is that he was rather flabbergasted by all this and not happy, and that Xi Jinping thought that he might make a scene and asked him to be removed. Now, health could also be a factor. I don't rule that out. I just don't think, having watched all these videos, I think there was a trigger. And I just think that the conversation there between Li Jianshu and Hu Jintao and the movement of all of those papers looked to me like that was the trigger. But to me, Hu Jintao did not look like he was totally incoherent. I mean, people said maybe he has dementia. I suppose that's possible. But I don't think that Xi Jinping wanted to just humiliate him. Some people have said that this was something that was orchestrated. They waited deliberately until the press came in, and then after all the foreign media were there for 5 minutes, they pulled Hu Jintao out. I don't think that Xi Jinping really benefits from humiliating Hu Jintao in that way. So I actually think Xi Jinping was trying to head off something that could have been more damaging to him if Hu Jintao had stood up and tried to disrupt the proceedings. But it's only a guess, and I hope we will someday know for sure.
Thank you. I have no better theory. Um, and since we're talking about personnel, there is another question about sort of what the 7 new members of the standing committee bring to the table for Xi. And this questioner is a philosopher who's particularly interested in Wang Huning's contribution.
Well, I don't have the bios of all of the new standing committee members in front of me, but as you said, Bei, it is important that 3 of them were prior personal secretaries. You can look at Li Qiang and say he has experience running some of the provinces. For example, he was in Shanghai, so he's been in major cities and municipalities. There are several others he's run, but he's never been at the national level. And I have to say that this is the first time since, I believe, 1976, that an individual has been, and he will be probably announced to be the premier, who has not come from being previously a vice premier. He's never been in the state council. He has no national government experience. So this is really quite unusual. But he is no doubt Xi Jinping's man. But Xi Jinping looked over other people who did have national level experience, and Wang Yang was seen by many as somebody who could continue to perhaps introduce some voice of reform. And obviously Xi Jinping chose not to do that. Now, Wang Huning is unique in many ways. He has served 3 different Chinese leaders, and there is no other person who has done that. Now, of course, he was not on the standing committee of the Politburo until the Xi Jinping era, until 5 years ago, but he did lead the Central Foreign Affairs Office. And it's the central office that does domestic work and foreign affairs. I don't remember the exact title, but this central party office, he was really the architect of Xi Jinping's ideology and some of the ideas of prior leaders. There have been really central concepts that were at the heart of things that Xi Jinping put forward, and before him, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, that were developed by Wang Huning. So he is the architect of the ideology. And Xi Jinping is clearly one of the most ideological leaders China has had in a very long time. And so I think Xi Jinping finds him very valuable as he tries to continue to infuse ideology into everything he does, all of his policies, I think, domestically as well as in foreign policy. So I think that he sees Wang Huning as somebody who was very useful to him.
I'm sure you've read it, but there's a great story in the New Yorker about how he came to the US in like 88, I think it was, and sort of what that effect had on him and his philosophy. I recommend it to our audience. So another question that I have, and we've gotten from the audience, is the situation with Taiwan. We're actually having another Mansfield dialogue in a month or two with Shelley Rigger, so there'll be more sort of focus on Taiwan and its domestic policy. But but it is, that is another thing that Xi Jinping doubled down on in his speech. And what do you see as the what she actually wants to do with Taiwan, what we can expect in the near future?
Well, that's a very important question, and it's hotly debated. There are people who believe that reunification is a legacy issue for Xi Jinping, that this is something he wants to solve in his term in office. And we don't know, let's remember, we don't know how long he will be in office. So it looks like, based on the decisions he has made regarding personnel in the standing committee, since he has not named a successor, or put anybody on the standing committee who could be his successor. The youngest person is 60, would have to be younger than that. Xi Jinping was 54 when he was put on the standing committee as the successor in training. So it is likely at least 10 years he will be in power. And of course, he could be there for life. So I read very, very closely everything that Xi Jinping says about Taiwan, all of the authoritative documents. And Xi Jinping has not said that he has made a decision to use force. He has not given up on peaceful reunification. He has said 3 times now that reunification is a requirement for the achievement of national rejuvenation, which is, again, by the middle of the century, by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And his words in the political report regarding Taiwan were restatements of things he has said elsewhere. He did reiterate that the party will strive its utmost capability to achieve reunification peacefully, but will never rule out the use of force. He talked about giving carrots, incentives to people in Taiwan. He warned separatists in Taiwan and warned against foreign interference. But I mean, we really did not see anything fundamentally new. Yet we have seen the PLA develop very significant capabilities. And some people believe that the PLA is getting close, probably not yet, but close to having the capability to invade and seize and control Taiwan. And there is a discussion about the possibility that maybe 2027 is a deadline for the acquisition of capabilities to do that. But again, no clear statement in any authoritative document. So even if it is a deadline of sorts, it is only for acquisition of capabilities, not necessarily intent. And so this is something that I think people are watching very, very closely. What are the things that could tip Xi Jinping in the direction of deciding he has to use force against Taiwan? It may be because he concludes that peaceful unification is impossible to achieve. It may be because he believes that the United States has decided to recognize an independent Taiwan, which there are some very senior Americans, including our former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who have said that the United States should recognize an independent Taiwan. Or he may do so for other reasons. Some people believe he could get distracted. He wants to distract his population from a declining economy, forge national unity. I myself think that he would not do that because if he tries to invade Taiwan and he fails, and China is weak and fragile to begin with, then he will probably, that would be the end of Communist Party rule in China. So that's a huge risk. So I think Xi Jinping is mindful of the potential costs that he would pay, and he will think through the costs before he makes that decision. I believe using force against Taiwan is truly a last resort, that Xi Jinping would rather achieve unification through the use of coercion. So peaceful unification is not necessarily peaceful. It means diplomatic, economic, military, coercion, disinformation, cyber attacks, all of these things. but it is in an effort to try to compel Taiwan to essentially surrender, to conclude that they cannot preserve their freedoms, and their life would be better if they actually unified with China. So the goal is to induce a sense of psychological despair and have Taiwan surrender. And they work very hard at that every day.
Interesting. So I'm curious about the impact on relations with the US. I'm curious how you think Xi is going to approach relations with the US, whether he will feel sort of even, more empowered vis-a-vis us, the US, and also what you would recommend to the Biden administration about any changes in its policies based on what has just happened.
Well, I believe that Xi Jinping has concluded that the United States is implacably hostile toward China, that the United States seeks to contain China's rise, set back China technologically. The recent export controls that were announced almost a month ago of essentially preventing China from acquiring advanced semiconductors and choking off their ability to develop them. I think it's just the latest example of an effort by the Biden administration to prevent China from acquiring capabilities that would enable them to dominate these strategic technologies of the 21st century, and particularly to develop military capabilities that could be used against us, against Taiwan, against our allies. And so I think that this is a conclusion that Xi Jinping has already reached. He may not want to have a confrontation with the United States. I don't think he seeks military conflict with the US. And so the question is, does he want to prevent further deterioration of this US-China relationship? And I think we will find out very soon. Xi Jinping will probably meet with President Biden at the G20 meeting in Bali, Indonesia, and we will see what approach he takes. Just yesterday, there were some signs that came out of Beijing. There was a statement that was read that at the gala event of the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations that was from Xi Jinping, which seemed to be giving a little bit maybe of an indication that he would like to see a better relationship. But of course, the question is on whose terms? Is it on China's terms? Is it at some compromise with the United States? And I think that the Biden administration is trying to figure out exactly what his intentions are, what the realm of the possible is. But US policy under the Biden administration has been quite clear and consistent in that they want to keep dialogue channels open. They want to cooperate with China where our interests converge, but they understand that this is a competition between different systems, that Xi Jinping's ambitions are detrimental to American interests. And we are willing to have this competition with them, but it has to be fair. But we want to prevent competition from spiraling out of control. So the Biden administration has prioritized putting in place what's been called guardrails or risk reduction measures. And so far, the Chinese have really not engaged. So we will find out whether they have any more of an appetite to do that now than they did before, whether they are interested in putting back on the agenda our cooperation on countering drug smuggling, on global health, on climate change. These are the three top issues of the Biden administration. We think that China has an interest in these things, but they have cut off all cooperation with the United States and several dialogues in the aftermath of Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And they're still angry. So we have not yet, I think, fully recovered and may not recover from that particular episode. But this could be an inflection point, so we should pay attention.
Thank you. And another question from the audience, that China's latest military strategy stressed the need to increase the PLA's capacity to fight and win wars. But in the Congress report, a nuance was introduced by mentioning local wars. Do you consider China's international security footprint is likely to grow beyond its periphery?
Well, China sort of went back to local wars in this Party Congress report after having taken it out last time. I do think that China believes that local wars are more likely. For example, on the Indian border, that would probably be the area where probably they would see that a local war is possible. A Taiwan Strait war is local, but it wouldn't necessarily remain local. It could escalate. It could become a broader conflict. And I think that the Chinese know that. So yes, they prepare for local wars, but I think they also realize that they have to begin to prepare for the possibility of a much bigger conflict with the United States. And I think there's a lot of thinking going into that as well. So it's interesting that they reintroduced that term. It was odd to me that they ever took it out to begin with.
A question just came in. I'll stay on the military side, but can you share any insight into China's likely response in the event of Putin nuking Ukraine?
Well, if Putin were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, my understanding is that it would likely be a small battlefield nuclear weapon. Over the last few days, there's been some discussions of the possibility of what we call a dirty bomb. And the Russians have even accused Ukraine of preparing to use a dirty bomb and then try to blame it on the Russians. Of course, this is all nonsense, but I suppose works in their disinformation propaganda campaign. So the Chinese have, in some private conversations, indicated that they do not want to see nuclear weapons used. But I doubt that they have conveyed that to the Russians. I think the kind of conversations that Xi Jinping has with Putin do not include things like that. I think that Putin probably knows how China feels, but this is not something that I think would be discussed. But if it actually were to happen, my guess is that the Chinese would say it was very unfortunate that nuclear weapons were used, but we must keep in mind that the war overall is the fault of NATO, right? That's been China's position since very early on. And so therefore, the United States and its NATO partners, I think China would say, bear some blame for the fact that we have gotten to a point in this conflict that nuclear weapons were used. And so I think they would ultimately try to blame the United States and its partners without endorsing the use of nuclear weapons, because that's not something that China feels comfortable with. But let's remember, they do continue to say that Russia has legitimate security concerns and that the West is arming Ukraine and leading to a protracted war. They say if we would just stop arming Ukraine, that would be the end of the war. And that's what China wants to see. They want to see the war ended. So if the use of a small nuclear weapon or dirty bomb led to an end of the war, that meant that the Russians had some form of a victory, then ultimately I can see how China would view that as in some way serving its interests. They don't want Putin to lose. They don't want him ousted from power.
Indeed. Do you have any thoughts about the status of the Belt and Road Initiative? It's a question, both about sort of what China's strategy will be, and then also what you think is likely to happen with funding in the near to medium term.
Well, there's a lot of good reports you could read on what's happening in the Belt and Road in various parts of the world. And I'll just sort of be brief on this because it really is quite a big topic. China's Belt and Road ran into problems. COVID, of course, exacerbated those problems, but there were some cases in which countries have taken on an enormous amount of debt. There were some loans that have been renegotiated. I believe Zambia is a case. In Sri Lanka, there is a big question now as to how that debt is going to be dealt with. Are they going to take IMF loans? Are they going to renegotiate with the Chinese? So there are different cases that face different problems, but China has, I think, already cut back, and you can look at the data. They've already cut back on the loans, the projects. The Belt and Road, of course, was written into the Constitution, so it is therefore one of the flagship components of Xi Jinping's foreign policy, but it's talked about less, and I think that it will get less focus going forward than some of the new initiatives that Xi Jinping has introduced in the last 6 months. And there I would point to the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. And so I think that that's where we should really be focusing. But there are problems left over from the Belt and Road. There are projects that remain unfinished. There is debt that has to be dealt with. Then there are cases where countries, of course, had hoped to get loans that really never got what they wanted. There'll still be more need for infrastructure, particularly in the global South. China's not going to be able to provide the solutions going forward, I think, that they did in the past because they're running out of money.
So staying on that in terms of global security, so what are your thoughts on Xi's concept of common security as a domestic policy and recent critiques that he's seeking absolute security in international relations?
I don't know what he means by absolute security, and I'd have to look at the context in which it is stated. First, let's say that security was mentioned more than any other term in the political report. In the Chinese version, it's 91 times. For those of you who know Chinese, it can mean safety also. So in the English version, it's only 80 times that it says security, and then the rest of them it's translated as safety. But security has permeated every element of Xi Jinping's policies. This is in the economy and in ideology. It is in of course, the educational system, the training of cadres, and very much in foreign policies. So, I mean, I have not seen him use the word absolute security. And so I'd have to look at whether or not it has been included in any authoritative document. But Xi Jinping is pushing, I think, the idea of more domestically is really more common prosperity. Security is certainly a part of, as I said, sort of all of his policies. And then he's pushing out the idea of greater security abroad, and China being a provider of that security. And so not being an ally, not having treaties as the United States does, we're not talking about a nuclear umbrella, but we're talking about security in a different sense. And you could look at the Solomon Islands as an example, where they signed an agreement. It's a security agreement. We don't know the text because it hasn't been released, but we understand that, China has offered that if there is some civil unrest, that China can send in its police and its law enforcement. Maybe that's an excuse to send in PLA officers, the military as well. Maybe China could use that kind of an opportunity to get more of a military foothold in the region, which we know that they have been seeking. So, I think we have to continue to watch closely how the Chinese advance their security agenda around the world.
Do you have any insight into the relationship between China and Afghanistan? This is a question coming from the audience. Are there rare earth elements in Afghanistan that China wants to acquire?
Oh, so here I'm going to have to be very general. I have a person on my team who is one of the leading experts of China's relationship with both Afghanistan and Pakistan. His name is Andrew Small. So if he were here, I would I would go all over to him. But the Chinese have essentially good relations with the government in Afghanistan, but the Taliban has been, as I understand it, I'm very disappointed that the Chinese have not come in and invested and helped them with economic development, because there isn't sufficient stability. There isn't the basis for investment yet. And so I don't think that it's really political reasons so much. I think the Chinese are happy to help, but I think that they believe that the circumstances are just not right yet. And so I think the government in Afghanistan has actually been disappointed in China. But that doesn't mean that China won't play a role going forward, just as China might play a role in Ukraine going forward. After the war is over, Ukraine is going to know that China might be a source of some funding for rebuilding. And there will be others as well, but China might well want to get in on from the bottom up.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a somewhat sort of domestic politics inside baseball question from an old friend, Ed Lanfranco.
Uh-oh.
With the CYL crushed, will new factions form around individuals who are with Xi in Zhejiang or Fujian? Are any new institutional factional groups possible?
Oh, my short answer to that is we've seen the end of factional politics for a while. That doesn't mean they won't reemerge in the future, but I don't think that we should try to understand Chinese leadership politics through the lens of factions. I believe that for some time. I'm not the only person who has said that. Some people have stuck to this methodology, but I think now it's clear that the Hu Jintao faction, the Jiang Zemin faction, these are done, finished. And Xi Jinping has brought his own people into the leadership. So we'll have to watch going forward whether new factions form. But my guess is that if we can see them forming, Xi Jinping certainly knows they're forming, and he would take measures to prevent that from happening. He has gone after his potential opponents and challengers ruthlessly in the past. And I have no doubt that he would do so in the future.
So finally, we have a question. Oh, we have a couple of more questions. And we are nearing the end of our time. So I think we will probably just take these two last questions. Joanna Shelton, who's on the board with me of the Mansfield Center, asks, could you please expand a bit on the global security and development initiatives?
All right, so here I'm going to I'm going to promote my podcast, which is my China Global podcast, and I do put out every 2 weeks a podcast on a different element of Chinese foreign policy and sometimes other sort of domestic related issues. The one that I just recorded today that will be out in about a week's time, a little bit over a week, is with Bates Gill. And we did talk about the 20th Party Congress, but did touch on the foreign policy goals and including the Global Security Initiative. And then I think it was a month or so ago that I did a special one on the Global Security Initiative with a leading Indian expert. And I'm forgetting his last name because it was hard for me to pronounce, but his first name is Minaj, and he was wonderful. Sheena Greitens also does terrific work on this. But the short answer is we don't know. the Global Development Initiative was rolled out at the UN, and that was just over a year ago. And the Chinese have tried to sign lots of countries up, but we still don't know what they're trying to achieve. And the Global Security Initiative, he announced at the Boao Forum in April, and we don't really know what it is yet. But this is quite typical of the Chinese, right? I mean, when they announced the 一带一路, the One Belt, One Road, nobody knew what it was. Even the Chinese didn't know. And then they started creating institutes and tapping into Chinese experts to develop it, to make policy suggestions, to come up with what it eventually would be. And so it's actually not surprising that Xi Jinping would put out some new idea, and then they would turn to put meat on the bones. That's what I think is happening. I just don't think they have a grandiose plan yet. But I think that over time, we will see it come together, and maybe, 6 months from now or a year from now, we will have a clearer idea as to what they hope to achieve.
So, okay, our last question. How do you think multinational corporations will react to this new government? There's a delegation of business leaders from Germany going to China next month. And then, isn't security the main goal of the US vis-a-vis China now? I lost that question. Okay. So yeah, that's it.
On the reference to the German delegation going is of course, this pertains to Chancellor Scholz from Germany, who will be going November 3rd and 4th to China. This is very controversial, by the way, in Europe. There are many countries who think that Chancellor Scholz should not be going to Beijing and celebrating the coronation of Xi Jinping for his third term, and particularly should not be bringing with him a business delegation, as Chancellor Merkel did so many times in the past. In fact, I was at a meeting recently where a leading expert on human rights suggested to a German official that maybe Chancellor Scholz should be taking with him a delegation of people who are concerned about human rights. Maybe you have family members who are being detained inside China, people who have experienced what's going on. For example, the incarceration of people in Xinjiang, or take representatives from civil society. Why take businessmen? So there's criticism of this visit, the timing, and what Chancellor Scholz might say while he's there, and we don't know. But we will see whether he is more sort of China friendly or critical, and if he's critical, is he just critical behind closed doors or also publicly? And I think that these are all really big questions going forward. The implications for businesses depend in part on what sector you're in. If you're an automobile manufacturer and you're producing for the Chinese market, and you are still selling a lot of automobiles, you're producing electric vehicles, and you have a good market share in China. Most of these companies are producing cars for the Chinese market inside China and then producing elsewhere in the world for other markets, and that makes sense. And that's the automobile sector might be, of course, quite different than others. So it depends. It's on a sector by sector basis, and then whether companies feel that they can still make money, whether they want to take the risks. We used to talk about a China +1 strategy. That is, that companies would have their factories in China, but then maybe set up one factory someplace else, like maybe in Vietnam. And it's increasingly looking like a China +1, +2, +3 strategy, where I think governments are trying to protect themselves more against possible loss inside China. We did see on the day that the new Standing Committee and Politburo were announced, that there was a significant drop in stock markets in China. And there was some capital flight. There's pressure on the currency. And I think that all suggests that there is a lack of confidence, and not only among multinationals, but perhaps also among Chinese businessmen who really do not want to see doubling down on state-run economy. They understand that China's growth has been led by the private sector primarily, and would like to see a return to some of the policies that are more favorable toward the private sector and have more market-oriented decisions. So we will have to see what companies do going forward, but there will certainly be some that will read the handwriting on the wall, see this doubling down on state-run approach, and decide that they need to cut their exposure further in China and perhaps even leave the Chinese market. But there will be others who will stay, who believe that there is money to be made, that they have good relationships with the Chinese government, and that they can continue to deal with some of these difficult challenges ahead.
That's a really good note to end on. Thank you so much, Bonnie, and thank you to the Mansfield Center for putting this on. As we know, the center could not put on programs like these without the incredible support of our donors and volunteers. If you'd like to make a donation, there is a link in the chat that was just put in. And thank you so much. This was a great conversation. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thanks for having me, Bay. Good to see you all, or at least talk to you all, but maybe next time in person.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. I think we're good.